are some chilling new details about the Sandy Hook school massacre. Police in Newtown, Connecticut, releasing search warrants in the case, which shed new light on shooter Adam Lanza's final moments. His rampage lasted less than 5 minutes, and in that time, he fired more than 150 shots. Lanza was wearing a bulletproof vest and military-style clothing, but what police found inside his home offers new insight into Lanza's life and his mental state leading up to this tragedy. Dr. Michael Stone is a forensic psychiatrist and a professor of clinical psychiatry at Columbia University's College of Physicians and Surgeons. Dr. Stone, thanks so much for being here. There's a lot to talk about. It was reported around the time, right after the Newtown shooting, that Adam Lanza, his brother, reportedly said he has Asperger's syndrome. And now, with the release of these new documents, we've learned that 2 books about Asperger's syndrome were removed from the house. Asperger's obviously being a high-functioning form of autism.
Yes.
Lots of people are diagnosed with Asperger's. We don't want to scare families right now, but could there be any connection in your mind?
Let's put it this way. The Asperger's syndrome is not associated with a high degree of violence, no more than any other mental illness. So there's a slight increase over the population average in mental ill people committing violent crimes, but not very much. But the point is about his particular variety of Asperger's. It was rather extreme in the sense that not only did they have the typical preoccupation with one interest, in his case, these dangerous games and guns and so on.
Violent video games, yeah.
The violent video games, but which is characteristic of Asperger's, and their social awkwardness, their inability to empathize and figure out what other people are feeling and to make small talk and like that. But his was extreme. As you know, when he was in the barber chair and the barber would ask him, hey, how you doing? He couldn't say anything. The mother would talk for him.
On that same note, it was also reported by his brother at the time, Adam Lanza's brother, who said he has Asperger's and a personality disorder. There's something else that we don't know yet, and the records don't shed much light on, but we had heard that he couldn't feel physical pain. He had to wear protective clothing in chemistry class so as not to get burned. Do you know of any disorder like that?
I've heard of it. I don't know very much about it. But as far as the personality part, he apparently had very tremendous paranoid feelings and vengeful feelings, etc. That would be the other aspect. In other words, the Asperger takes care of the social awkwardness. But in addition, he seemed to have a great deal of hatred and resentment. That's the personality part. People
always speculated that he must have been on some sort of psychotropic drugs to treat some of this, and unfortunately, in the records that have been released, they found no evidence that he was on any sort of drugs. Doesn't mean that he wasn't, but they haven't revealed anything like that.
Well, I'm not surprised because there really are no particular medications that would make a big difference with someone like that. In other words, paranoid personality and Asperger's are not things that can be remedied by a medication.
Something interesting that came out of the just released documents are they found newspaper clippings of a similar shooting, school shooting. He had saved newspaper clippings from a shooting in 2008 at Northern Illinois University in which 5 people were killed, 21 were injured, 26 victims, in other words, just like the 26 victims in Newtown, Connecticut, with people. Well, I mean, obviously, police always fear copycat crimes, and it sounds like he may have been studying things like this.
He apparently was studying things like that. Of course, I studied things like that, too, to be an expert in it. But he did look at clippings from the Kazmierczak killing in Northern Illinois that you just mentioned, and a lot of other ones. He had a big list of them. So it sounds as if he was going to get his 15 minutes of fame that Andy Warhol promised us all through this multiple murder.
As you know, lawmakers right now are trying to figure out how to keep guns out of the hands of, unhinged people, including mentally ill people. Are you, as a psychiatrist, comfortable with the notion that psychiatrists and doctors would have to report people who come into their offices with some sort of personality disorder if they're a danger they think to other people or to themselves?
I would only be comfortable if I heard from a patient that he intended or she intended, it was mostly a he, intended to hurt somebody, in which case, and I have done it in the past, report that to either the intended victim or the authorities if there was no named intended victim. But apart from that, if just of the person I sized up as having a mental illness of some degree, but showed no propensity at all to committing
Violent
harm,
tendency.
I would certainly not report that to anyone.
That makes sense. Dr. Michael Sohn, thanks so much for your expertise. It's interesting to talk in light of this tragedy. Thank you.
It just appears, too, despite all that we learned yesterday, there's still so much left that we need to learn, too.
Yeah.